I'm Michael Green, the CEO of the U.S. Studies Center. I want to welcome you and Professor David Shambaugh to Gadigal Country and the University of Sydney. David Shambaugh is one of the most renowned China scholars in the world. We're delighted to have him join us. He's also a good friend. We taught each other's courses for, I don't know how many years. David at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., me at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. It's a lot of Georges and a lot of Washingtons. David was teaching a course on the international relations of Asia, and I would do the Japan lecture for him. I was teaching a course on post-war Asian leaders, and David would do the Deng Xiaoping lecture for me. And what always blew the students away was David Shambaugh hung out with Deng Xiaoping, because when Deng made his famous trip to the United States, David was a young officer in the White House on the National Security Council staff in charge of China, working for the very famous leader or head of Asian studies at the time, and was able to tell the students not only sort of how politically Deng did his reforms, the historical context, but what he looked like and what he talked about, and his interest in basketball, I think.
Came up to here.
And yeah, about half your size. So David brings rich scholarship and deep personal understanding of China and China-U.S. relations. He's published a book called Breaking the Engagement: How China Won and Lost America. And it's a very timely book. You don't know where the U.S.-China relationship's going if you don't know where it came from. And I also think it's a very, very important topic for our friends in Australia to hear, because there's such debate about U.S.-China relations and what it means for Australia. But not much of that discussion and debate actually unpacks what U.S.-China relations look like. It's complicated. The relationship, as this title implies, Breaking the Engagement, is in a very different place than when David worked for the Carter administration or when I worked for the George W. Bush administration. Very different. And the question is, where does it go from here? We don't know, but we'll at least get some sense of what to watch for and where we've been. So very delighted you can join us, David. David will give a presentation on his book and on contemporary U.S.-China relations. We'll have a bit of a back and forth, and then we'll open it up for your questions. There are some very distinguished China scholars in the audience, including one of David's former students, who I hope will ask a really hard question. So please welcome David Shambaugh.
Okay, right. Thanks. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mike, for the generous introduction and the invitation to speak here at the U.S. Studies Center at Sydney Uni, I think you call it here. My first visit to Sydney Uni and to the U.S. Studies Center. So it's really a great pleasure. I'm in country for about almost 2 weeks, and this is the last stop, a very productive trip. And I thank all of you for coming this evening. Thanks very much. I am going to, well, the first thing I want to say is to say that Professor Green is not a permanent export from the United States to Australia. He's just on long-term loan. We hope he returns to the motherland, as they say in China, at some point. But great to see you again, Mike. Really, we're very close friends, close colleagues, and as he just said, our universities are kind of siblings, and we teach in each other's courses. And I've admired and learned from Mike over the years a lot about Japan, about the Indo-Pacific, things that I don't have expertise in. So I thank you, Mike, for inviting me tonight to discuss this brand new book just out last week in the United States. And it'll take a while for it to work its way down under, although it is available, the electronic version is available here. A couple of folks in the audience have done that already. And the hard copies will get here eventually. This is what it looks like. I just brought, there's one, it exists. So I'm going to um, tell you some about the book. It's a big book, 430 pages, fairly good sized book. So only one can do only so much in half an hour or so to try and summarize the book, maybe incentivize you to get a copy. You know, Christmas is not that far away. Makes a great gift for your loved ones. But in all seriousness, so this book has been percolating in my mind for really a very long time, as I've taught U.S.-China relations for several decades. And it's sort of stimulated by two puzzles that have perplexed me, I've wrestled with in my annual course on U.S.-China relations and, and watching and participating in the U.S.-China relationship. The first puzzle is more historical. Second puzzle, you might say, is more contemporary. So the first puzzle that I've wrestled with and has been what has caused the repetitive fluctuation in the U.S.-China relationship over time. And by time, I mean centuries, not just decades, going back to the late Qing to the present. The United States-China relationship has been anything but steady and consistent. If the overriding characteristic is, in fact, its fluctuation from, you might say, amity to enmity, back to amity to enmity, and the cycle just seems to repeat itself over and over. In fact, the late great historian Warren Cohen, I don't know if that's a name known to all of you here, who sadly just passed away about 6 weeks ago in Washington, one of our, in the world's leading China historians. He has written a lot about U.S.-China relations. He referred to this fluctuating pattern as the love-hate cycle in U.S.-China relations. Americans love the Chinese, and then they go through these periods of, I mean, hate is too strong of a term, and vice versa, the Chinese towards America. But there's been this duality. So that's the kind of historical puzzle I've wrestled with. And in fact, the first chapter is entitled Elusive Equilibrium. The more contemporary puzzle that animates this book or stimulates this book is why, after 4 decades of the American engagement with China, in which the US and the Chinese governments and societies both became deeply entwined since the Carter administration. I was indeed present at the creation, as Dean Acheson would have said. I was on the south lawn of the White House when Deng Xiaoping came in 1979, January, to initiate the normalization of U.S.-China relations. I met him 3 times on that trip. He spoke to him in Chinese, little bits, but and since then I had the great good fortune to work in the Carter administration under Michael Oxenberg and Michael Armacost and Zbigniew Brzezinski in the National Security Council 1977-78 in a 2-year run-up to the normalization, and had played a very, very, very small minor role in preparing for normalization. And then after that, I returned to graduate school, and I've, you might say, lived engagement for the last 4+ decades myself. Okay, so, but the puzzle is, why, after 4 decades of entwinement, engagement, enmeshment, whatever how you want to describe it as, why over the past decade has this given way, has this unraveled and given way to what I describe in the book as comprehensive competition, where frictions and systemic disengagement have become the overriding character of the relationship. That's just the last 10 years. So we have 4 decades of essentially cooperative, linear. Yes, we had crises, and it was not completely steady, but the relationship nonetheless progressed in a more or less cooperative fashion. So then why is it that today in these are Pew Research data. Why is it that more than 80%, I think 83% of the American public have unfavorable views of China? You can see how after 2017, they become even more unfavorable. Moreover, the American public, 42% describe China as an enemy. 50% describe it as a competitor, while only 6%, according to these most recent Pew polls, see China as a partner. I don't know how these polls would stack up against the recent Lowy polls on China. But so this is the contemporary puzzle. How did this state of affairs of the last decade come to pass? So these two puzzles, and the answer to them, and the basic argument, excuse me, of the book is that over the 4 decades from the 1980s through the 2010s, China won over America through its generally reformist domestic policies and its generally through its foreign policies that were generally status quo over that period of time. But those policies of the Chinese side coincided with the American engagement policy. The premises coincided with the premises and the expectations of the United States. So you might say that the American expectations of China were the independent variable, and China's behavior and policies the dependent variable that I look at across time in this book. I'll say more in a moment about what these American expectations were. But in short, when China's policies and behavior conformed with American expectations, the two could cooperate and generally had non-conflictual relations. However, when China did not conform to American expectations, frictions followed. That's the core argument of the book, or the core conclusion from the data of the book. Now, moreover, I found, ironically, that the deeper the engagement and the presence of each side in the other's country, the deeper the suspicions and the greater the frictions that emerged. Now, this is not only an irony, it's counterintuitive because engagement was premised on the liberal, with a capital L, assumption that the deeper and broader each side's presence in and interactions with the other, the greater the cooperation and the stronger the relationship would be. Right? That was the theory. That was the theory. Quite to the contrary, I found. Beginning around 2010, go back, around 2010, a number of American and other foreign actors began to encounter considerably increased obstacles to their work in China. NGOs, journalists who've never had an easy time in China, it became even worse. American companies, philanthropic foundations, universities, and educational exchange organizations, American Embassy and its consulates, and other American actors all began to encounter increased impediments and obstacles to their normal work in the country around 2009-10. And looking back on it, I think that 2010 was a real turning point in China's recent history when it became much more controlled and internally and much more assertive externally. Now, I experienced it too. I was actually a senior Fulbright scholar in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences that year in Beijing at the Institute of World Economics and Politics. Not the first time I'd been a visiting scholar in CAS. It was in fact the 6th institute in which I have been a resident visiting scholar in the Academy of Social Sciences. Previous experiences had all been pretty good, including 1989 and 90, right after the Tiananmen Massacre. where I was in the Institute of Marxism-Leninism of all places during that year, but it went all right in research terms. But 2009-10, the Academy did its best to, well, let me just say they didn't do their best to help facilitate my research. They put blocks one after another in my way, as they were doing with other academics. Very strange. I was well known to them. I had helped them. I used to do some consulting work for the Ford Foundation. I handed out, you might say, a couple hundred fellowships to Academy staff to go abroad to improve, to study. And, so I was a friend of the Academy of Social Sciences, but you wouldn't have known it in 2010. So 2010 was and I have theories about why that was a turning point year. And notice this is 2 years before Xi Jinping came to power. This is the end of the Hu Jintao era. We all date the changes in China from 2012 when Xi Jinping becomes #1. Well, in fact, I think you can really trace them to 2010. So then in 2012, and over the last 13 years, these trends and obstacles have only dramatically increased domestically in China and externally with what international China specialists refer to as China's, quote, assertiveness. Their wolf warrior public diplomacy and their hyper-nationalism, their rough edge. And so we've seen a very different China in the last 13 years. And the United States and other countries, including Australia, have had a difficult time. Everything in China in recent years under Xi Jinping has become securitized. 安全化 in Chinese. National security, 国家安全, is the #1 government and party priority. No longer 发展, development. 发展 has been overtaken by 国家安全. And Xi Jinping has what he calls the 总体国家安全观, which translates as the comprehensive security concept, which has no fewer than 22 categories of national security. Each category has a number of subpoints. So this country, China, is just everything has been securitized. And moreover, that's domestically in China. But moreover, in the past decade, China has stepped up its own malign interference and influence activities abroad, including here in Australia. In fact, Australia was at the forefront of crafting legislation and pushing back against such activities during the Turnbull government. But the United States began to experience this interference that violated American laws, impacted a variety of actors in American society, American states, universities, civil society, media, and our own national security. And I say China stepped up these activities, which are generally called United Front activities, some of which are United Front, but they're a series of other more intrusive activities. They've long been doing this, but they increased and were being called out here in Australia, in Europe, and in the United States in the last 10 years. So the point is here that mutual securitization on the Chinese side and the American side, because the American government also reacted to China's interference activities in our society, as the Australian government did here. So the mutual securitization of the relationship has contributed to the trend that you see beginning there in 2017, then the downward trajectory of the relationship. So make no mistake, or the argument of the book is Xi Jinping broke engagement. Xi Jinping's policies, domestically and externally, contradicted the American expectations of engagement, but directly impacted a whole variety of actors that I call the engagement coalition. And one by one, these actors peeled away from the coalition, and the coalition crumbled. And we now have a situation where the relationship has been in a pretty bad place, a contentious place, highly competitive place, why I call it comprehensive competition. And a new coalition has replaced the engagement coalition. I call it the counter-China coalition in Congress, in society, in civil society, and other parts of the American public. Okay, so that's the basic argument of the book. Now, what was, you might ask, what was the strategy of engagement intended to do and achieve in the first place? Well, there was, well, first of all, there's no sort of mastered secret document in the US National Archives that answers this question. Indeed, each administration amended the core elements of engagement, at least what I think engagement was intended to achieve. So there were 4 general elements to the strategy of engagement and 7 tactics to implementing the strategy. Very Chinese, right? The four strategies and the 7 tactics. And what were these? Okay, so here are the 4 elements of the engagement strategy, and you can read for yourselves. And this goes back to 1979 and the Carter administration. This is what Michael Oxenberg was working on, and very explicitly so. First, to modernize China economically and technologically, or to contribute to China's modernization. Secondly, to liberalize China politically and socially. Notice I did not say democratize, I said liberalize. There's a difference. Many people say, oh, the Americans, they wanted to democratize China. Well, I don't know any American, really, I know a few who think that China could be democratized. Liberalized, yes. So that's the second strategy, the political component of the engagement strategy. Third is to socialize, well, to integrate China into the international order, post-World War II order. What is that order? It's the international liberal order with a capital L, and to thereby socialize the country into the norms and practices and regulations and laws of the post-World War II international order. That's the third element of the strategy that every American government since Carter has pursued. And then the last element I describe as engagement as process, to exchange multiple people in multiple professions between the 2 societies and the 2 governments. Okay, to repeat, to modernize, liberalize, socialize, and exchange with China. Okay, that's what the Americans have been trying to do for 4.5 decades with the People's Republic of China. Change them. Now, if those are the strategies, how do you achieve it? How do you implement it? What are the tactics for doing so? So here are my 7 tactics. The first is government-to-government institutionalization. What Michael Oxenberg, in fact, who was a student of Chinese bureaucracy, he described this at the time, I remember well, talking to him in his office in the old executive office building. He said, David, we have to marry the bureaucracies together, marrying bureaucracies. Transportation department, public health with public health, you know, defense with defense. Every ministry in both of the governments, he argued, had previously had negative missions vis-a-vis the other during the Cold War, right? And whatever resources they had, they were to counter the other. Oxenberg's vision was to turn those negative bureaucratic missions into positive bureaucratic missions of cooperation between government ministries. So that was the first one. Second tactic, to build society-to-society ties at the sub-national level. Third is to create civil society in China, because as we all know, civil society is an important liberalization phenomenon on the way to democratization. Third, that was the third. The fourth tactic was to invest in and trade with China. Why? Not just to take advantage of, Ricardo's um, um, theory of comparative advantage, but to contribute to the marketization of the Chinese economy. You might call it the capitalism of the Chinese economy, and thereby erode the planned state economy that China had been practicing. So that was the tactic vis-a-vis the economy. Then there was a fifth tactic to improve China's domestic governance and professional capacity building. That's what I was doing for the Ford Foundation, handing out hundreds of fellowships, send them abroad, send them to Australia, send them to America, send them to England, send them elsewhere to learn how the Western world functions. So that it would go back and improve that whatever profession they were in, and allow, professional counterpart conversations and relationships, real cooperation. So that was the fifth, and then you can see for yourself, the sixth tactic was to build the rule of law in China based on what kind of law? Western law and legal principles. And the last tactic that the US has pursued has been to educate Chinese students. Why? Well, two reasons. One goes back to the modernization element of the strategy, so that whatever field they were studying, they would return to their home country and contribute to the modernization of it. But B, that they would return having been exposed to a free society and democracy, and they would therefore become agents of political change. Yeah, that's what we were up to. That was the secondary element. That was the hope. And, interestingly enough, 4+ decades later, these millions of students have not been agents of political change, with the exception of the spring of 1989. Okay, so taken together, these are the elements of the engagement strategy in my view. Now, one can certainly question the assumptions and the goals behind it as being misplaced, naive, hubristic, typically American, imperialistic. Yeah, I know all the counter arguments. I can look out in the room. I can see people think, oh, this American. What do they think they're doing, these Americans? But that's what I think we're up to with the Chinese. Now, to be sure, the Chinese, and here by which I mean the Chinese Communist Party, I want to be very precise, for good reason, saw these strategies and tactics as what? Subversive, to undermine their power and control. Indeed, the Chinese Communist Party has been on high alert to American subversion ever since 1957, when John Foster Dulles, then the Secretary of State, gave famous testimony in the Congress in which he called for the, quote, peaceful evolution of all communist societies in the world: Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, Communist China, Vietnam. And so that was picked up in 1957. Chairman Mao, in fact, gave an important speech commenting on Dulles's testimony. And ever since 1957, the CCP has been very alert to and trying to block such efforts. Okay, so in other words, American liberalism has met Chinese Leninism. That's the rub here. American engagement policy was fundamentally based on liberal, with capital L, premises and assumptions to change China in a liberal direction. Well, the Chinese Communist Party, being deeply Leninist, they didn't want to go there. But actually, during several decades, from Deng's visit in '79 on through to 2017, I would argue that the Chinese government took advantage of what was offered to them to help to the United States, and they sublimated their fears of subversion in favor of more tangible, pragmatic ends that they could get from the United States in terms of technology, investment, training, and other things. Okay, so that's how China, I would say, won America. And indeed, other countries, European other Asian nations all accepted this basic strategic policy logic of engagement, had their own versions, you might say, of engagement with China. But to fully understand, see, where are we in terms of time? Okay. I think to really understand this strategy, it's not enough to go back to Michael Oxenberg and Jimmy Carter. You have to go much further because it's deeply rooted in the American approach to China dating to the 19th century. Yes, the 19th century. Back in here are the first two American ambassadors to China. On the left, Anson Burlingame, and on the right, J. Ross Brown. Now, Burlingame and Brown epitomize what I argue in the book, if there's one core theme in America's approach to China over the centuries, it's been to this so-called missionary impulse to mold and shape China. That far predates 1979, it far predates President Nixon's visit in 1972. So Burlingame and Brown, back in the 1880s, they were certainly trying to shape the Qing court. But interestingly, and the reason I put their photographs up is they had very different tactics for doing so. And one has seen over the centuries, the United States pursue these alternative sets of tactics. First tactic, Burlingame advocated what he called the cooperative policy, what you might call patient paternalism, to work with Chinese reformers of the Qing, Li Hongjiang, Zhang Guofan, others, in a cooperative fashion. By contrast, Brown, he favored what he called the coercive policy, to pressure the Qing court to undertake reforms. Burlingame, in other words, indulged the Chinese, even learning the language. Chinese Qing court liked him so much, they appointed him as the representative of all foreign emissaries to China. We like you, Mr. Burlingame. You know, you're trying to be like us. You're learning our language. And you're not pressuring us, and you're trying to help us in a benign way. Well, that's what we wish all these Europeans were doing. So we appoint you to represent the Europeans, everybody else. Brown, on the other hand, though, was very condescending, even racist, advocated tough diplomatic pressure, moral condemnation, and the threat of force. So here you have two very different approaches, one indulgent, one coercive. And I mention this because over the past 2+ centuries, I think the United States has alternated back and forth between these cooperative versus coercive approaches. But again, the point is the Americans have been trying to change China for a very long time. It's in American DNA. Unlike other countries, I can't think of another country on the planet where the Americans have had such a lengthy, sort of dedicated commitment to trying to alter another society. In a benevolent way, I would argue. Even back during the height of the Cold War, there were advocates inside the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, who were pushing for relaxing the containment policy on China and opening the door to China. In fact, in President Kennedy's last press conference prior to his tragic assassination in 1963, you can read for yourself. He said, "We are not planning on trade with Red China." He was asked by a journalist, do you, the United States, plan to follow the Canadian example of relaxing trade? This is during the Great Leap Forward famine, when 40 million people, we now know, perished from famine. The Canadians relaxed their controls on exports of wheat and other foodstuffs, pharmaceuticals. And so it was a question for the Kennedy administration, are you going to follow the Canadians? And you can read for yourself what Kennedy said. In view of China's policy, but if the Red Chinese, as it was known then, indicated a desire to live at peace with the United States, with other countries surrounding it, then quite obviously the United States would reappraise its policies. Last sentence, we are not wedded to a policy of hostility to Red China. This is 1963. sadly, 12 days later, he was assassinated. Okay, but what was going on in the 60s? At the height of the Vietnam War, there were a number of civic actors, civil society actors in the United States. The American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, the League of Women Voters, the UN Association of the United States, the American Chamber of Commerce, all of whom were advocating for the relaxation of containment and opening the door to China. And this led to the creation of three important organizations in the US in the late 60s, the National Committee on US-China Relations, the Committee on Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China, and the National Council on US-China Trade, now called the US-China Business Council. There's all, okay. Now, so President Nixon, he too wanted to change China. You may be under the impression that he opened to China simply to counter the Soviet Union. Well, yes, significantly, but that was by no means all of Nixon's goals. Very famous article he published in 1967, you can read here, to the extent, our aim, to the extent that we can influence events should be to induce change in China and in China's external behavior. So Nixon, when Kissinger and Winston Lord, to whom my book is dedicated, by the way, who I admire tremendously, when Winston Lord and Kissinger went on the secret trip in 1971, and then Nixon himself went in 72, he was really pushing on an open door in American society because there were advocates for relations with the People's Republic of China. Okay. And so this is the context of the argument of the book. For the sake of time, I'm going to just put these next few slides up and let you digest them. I'm not going to walk you through them. This is the table of contents. So I've essentially already discussed chapters 1 through 4. Chapter 5 is concerned with the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, and even a little section I slipped in January as the book was going to press on the prospects for the second Trump administration. And then I move in the second half of the book to how engagement unraveled. Chapter 6 is called Inside the Beltway. It deals with the actors at the national level, the executive branch, the Congress, the US military, the American intelligence and counterintelligence communities. Then chapter 7 goes outside the Beltway into the country and looks at a whole range of non-governmental actors, NGOs, American universities, the business community, and American states. And I show in detail in each of those 4 cases how each of those 4 communities became progressively alienated from China, hence the Chinese lost America with these communities. Then the book has a chapter at number 8 I call the Great American China Policy Debate of recent years. It's still going on, but it's been very intense for the last decade or 8 years or so. And I break this debate down into 5 different schools of thought. I put different individuals based on their writings into one of these 5 schools, the first being what I call the stealthy rival school. The idea here is that China has a secret grand strategy to undermine, overtake, and replace the United States as the world's principal power. For this school, all the dots connect in China's domestic and global behavior, and they point to a regime doing its best to undermine the United States and the global liberal order. So that's number 1. I'm not going to tell you who fits into these 5 schools. You're going to have to buy the book to see for yourselves. But second school is the comprehensive competition school, which is a kind of loose coalition of those who argue that the United States is locked into a series of essentially zero-sum competitive relationship in different functional spheres: security, diplomacy, commerce, technology and innovation, higher education, ideology, domestic politics and ideology, global governance, and other areas. The United States and China are contesting, have totally different approaches to those spheres, and they're contesting each other, and that this school argues the US needs to go on the offense in each of these spheres and push back against China and to resist China while advancing America's own national interests. Third school is the re-engagement school. Needless to say, most of the people in this school were very much part of the engagement school in the previous decades, many of them former government officials, and they just can't quite let go. They can't really satisfy, or they're very disturbed that the relationship has gone off the rails in the last 10 years. And in fact, they blame the American side primarily for the deterioration of the US-China relationship. I guess it reminds me of John Maynard Keynes' famous statement, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" Well, these people haven't changed their mind. They still argue for re-engaging the Chinese. They think that we have to get back to the old engagement strategy, should never have abandoned it under Trump and Biden in the first place, that the strategy still serves American interests well. China, according to them, is not an adversary or even a competitor of the United States. And therefore, the American side needs to just sort of take a deep breath, re-extend the hand to Beijing, and re-engage with Beijing. So that's the third school in this big American debate. Fourth school, I label the strategic empathy school. It's a more recent group of individuals, slight variant of the re-engagement school, but these individuals think that China is only reacting to the sort of aggressive, assertive American actions. They're protecting themselves. Quite naturally, they argue that the United States thus needs to better understand, they argue, China's insecurities, not provoke them, not demonize China, but rather to be, quote, strategically empathetic. That's the fourth group. And the last group is the managed competition school, typical really of the the second 2 years of the recent Biden administration. They argue that competing with China, yes, is the grand strategy and the reality, but and America should compete assertively so, but at the same time, establish a series of guardrails, buffers, off-ramps, and dialogue mechanisms, some of which are resurrected from the Cold War with vis-a-vis the Soviet Union during the détente phase of the Soviet Union, and that this competition has to be managed. Otherwise, it can become adversarial and could lead to a real hot war. So that's the fifth school, and just tag that. Let me just finish by, there's a final chapter where let's see here, give my own views. Shambaugh puts his cards on the table finally. I haven't been publicly writing about the American-China strategy in a number of years, and some may have noticed. It was intentional. But I lay out my own views, and I argue in the book and in this chapter for what I call assertive competition and competitive coexistence. So I am kind of a combination of schools number 2 and 5, comprehensive competition and managed competition. Oops, sorry, go back. Then there's an appendix, really interesting appendix. I flip the script. I turn the story around and I look at a number of internal Chinese writings. Yes, I read Chinese and I have access to some pretty interesting Neibu materials. And I look at a decade or so of China's so-called America specialists, the subject about which I wrote my own PhD dissertation 40 years ago, China's America Watchers. So I've been watching their watchers for a long time. They didn't understand the United States very well then, back in the 1980s when I was researching and wrote my dissertation called Beautiful Imperialist. They still do not understand the United States very well. And they missed it. Everything I argue about the erosion of the engagement coalition and the disenchantment on the part of many actors in the United States with China's own behavior, they just missed it. It was a massive intelligence failure on China's part. And then all of a sudden Trump comes into office and wham, they get hit with the strategic competition of the first Trump administration. They did not see it coming. So that's what the appendix does. It digs down into this internal Chinese discourse and it asks, has there been a who lost America debate in China? And does China bear any responsibility for the profound shift in American attitudes and policies and the disintegration of engagement? The answer, in short, is a resounding no. The Chinese side accepts zero blame for the deterioration of the relationship. It's all the Americans' fault. So there has not been a who lost America debate. They would do well, the Chinese side, to read this book, although I'm not anticipating any translations of it. That's a summary of the book, and I'm sorry I've gone a little over time, but I'm happy to entertain your questions. Mike and I are going to have a conversation, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. That was outstanding. And I think the book is going to shed some real light on a dynamic that people are struggling to understand. By the way, I don't think there's been a who lost Australia debate in China either, or a who lost Japan debate. Let me ask a few questions and tease out some of the arguments, then we'll open it up to the floor. I think you'll recall maybe 6-7 years ago, we hosted a closed door meeting at Georgetown of all the China and Asia scholars who'd been in government since Reagan to try to unpack what happened. And this was about the time of the 2018 Trump national security strategy that put out there strategic competition as a frame for us, which had not happened since Nixon, basically. And so people like Susan Shirk from UCSD, who was in the Clinton administration,
Right.
Tom Christensen and me from Bush, Evan Medeiros from Obama, and so forth. One thing we all agreed on was it was not our fault. Personally, we were all good. And then we had a big debate about so what happened, and I want to push a little more on and get your thinking. So one line of thought was it was structure. So this was the Thucydides trap that, Athens and Sparta, this was inevitable. It didn't really matter whether we had bureaucracies for peace in both sides or clever communiques. Once the Soviet threat that binded us was gone, it was only a matter of time. So that's one argument. It was structural. Xi himself is somewhat drawn to that, as you know, because he likes the Thucydides trap argument. The second argument was, no, it was agency. It was really Xi. This particularly came from those of us who'd been involved in summits with Zhang and Hu, because Xi was very, very different, very aggressive. And so it was all about Xi. And then the third argument was, no, it was contingency. It was the global financial crisis, for example, which completely ordered Chinese thinking about American power and legitimacy and China's own role in the world. So the obvious answer is all of the above. But depending on which one you weight, what you do about a part's quite different. If you think it's structural, then goodness gracious, buy cans of beans and bullets, right? If it's Xi, we wait him out. If it's contingency, we re-engage. So looking at the structural arguments, the Thucydides trap, Morgenthau sort of Mearsheimer type arguments, it was Xi, it is Xi, and then the contingency. Where do you put your weight of emphasis?
That's a great way to frame it, Mike. I'm not sure I was at that session, but I think that's a very elegant.
In Singapore or some places, I recall.
I was on sabbatical, that's right. And the obvious answer is all three, but I would associate myself with the agency argument, but a little bit of the other two. The structural dimension, the Mearsheimer, Graham Allison school, that I would argue has contributed to the agency, right? As China has grown stronger and more, equal with in power terms, the United States, they are feeling their oats. They're feeling more hubristic and able to push back. There was always an asymmetry in the power structure between the two countries. China needed America for 4 decades. So it sublimated, I argue in the book, its discontent with various American actions because they needed to modernize and they couldn't do so without the United States. So they swallowed hard in essence. But now in recent years, there's a greater symmetry on the power side. That has taken together with Xi Jinping's own personality, but the party and the third contingency, global financial crisis, absolutely was a turning point in their perceptions of the US. That's why I say 2910 was in fact the key turning point in China's trajectory, which came right out of the global financial crisis. There are a few other things that happened that year internally in China, the riots in Tibet, riots in Xinjiang, 180,000 demonstrations across the country, according to China's own Ministry of Public Security. Their definition of a demonstration is 100 people or more. So they had 180,000 incidents of mass unrest, quote unquote. So the place was really churning at the end of the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era. So contingent, all three, it kind of came together, a perfect storm when Xi came to power. They didn't start pushing back in the last 2 years of the Hu Jintao era when you were hand delivering notes to Hu Jintao and interacting with Hu. That came with Xi. So I think it's really agency, but the other two factors fed into the agency.
So in terms of strategy, that explains your combination of managed competition and comprehensive competition, because it means this is not forever, basically. Yeah.
It's not forever. And I would note, especially with Professor Davis in the audience, that scholars and students of Chinese politics refer to something called the Fang Shou cycle. Fang, it means opening, Shou means closing. And I think actually Rick Baum is the one who coined this term originally, and he noticed an oscillation in Chinese own domestic politics during the Deng to the era afterwards, that it alternates between essentially 7 years of opening, and then the Leninist state pulls back for about 2 years, and then 7 more years, 7-2, 7-2. There have been something like 7 of these cycles, the Fang Shou cycle. Well, we are in year 13 right now of Shou under Xi Jinping. That country is way overdue for a lot of Fang. But the point is, there is a oscillating dynamic within the Communist Party. There are a lot of party members and various levels who are very discontent with what Xi Jinping has done over the last 13 years, domestically and externally. And they, in fact, blame him for the deterioration of the US-China relationship, amongst other things. And if he were to slip in the bathtub tonight and be gone from the leadership tomorrow, I would hypothesize and wager that the party would snap back to the Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao reformist path, domestically and externally, because there is this dynamic inside of China. And then if they did snap back, the United States and a lot of other countries could deal with them again in a better fashion, but they are the ones who have changed. Now, President Trump in the United States is obviously changing too, but that's the short answer.
That's a great bumper sticker for somebody more Fang, less Shu. How about China's weakness as a driver? The global financial crisis showed many Chinese scholars and leaders, and many Americans thought the flaws in the Anglo-American capitalist model.
Right.
But the wave of the Arab street and the unrest and the social instability that followed was, I think, terrifying for Chinese leaders as well. So is Chinese weakness also a driver, or fears of internal weakness?
Instead of using the word weakness, I would replace it with insecurities.
Yeah.
Chinese communist insecurities. And it goes back to the peaceful evolution business, but the Arab Spring and then the color revolutions across Central Asia really spooked them. And I have it on good authority from 2 Chinese foreign ministry officials. I think I put this into my Mao to Now book. They witnessed physically at one of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings, Putin grabbing hold of Hu Jintao by the lapel of his suit and saying, through a translator, if you don't get a grip on these international NGOs in China the way we in Russia are doing, you too will have a color revolution. So
What year was that?
Would have been 2009. It was 2009. As I was told the subsequent year, and it was 6 months after, these two diplomats who were standing as close as you and I are, they overheard the translate. They saw, and then they were kind of curious, what is Putin doing, pulling our presidents by the lapel? So, true story. Putin was obviously spooked by the color revolutions, but the CCP got very spooked. And that's when they passed the NGO law, the international NGO law, and they began to crack down on the foreign civil society presence in China. They just began to tighten up domestically because of their insecurities, political insecurities.
The drafting of that NGO law was happening in 2004 and 5, and I was in the White House and we knew about it. So President Bush told President Hu in a bilateral summit that it was not a good idea for U.S.-China relations, and that I would, after the meeting, sit down with your good friend Hu Yafei, the foreign ministry senior official, to talk about why. And my argument was, what became your book, if you close down civil society, you are
breaking engagement,
breaking some of China's best friends in the United States, universities, religious organizations, NGOs, foundations. And your book sort of chronicled. They controlled it for a while. The MFA, the foreign ministry, controlled it for a while, but then the law passed.
The security state got a hold, the Chinese security state, Ministry of State and Public Security, got hijacked their internal and external agenda.
And the Ministry of State Security just took charge of those things. What about the Anson Burlingame and the engagers in the U.S.? So can you say a little bit more about their counterparts in China? You have an appendix at the end about Wang Jieshi and other scholars of America and scholars of international relations. But of course, the pro-engagement community in China was much bigger than that. It included, it included Premier Zhu Rongji during the WTO accession talks, and during the debate about TPP, and the business community. There were not just sort of idealistic views of America-China relations, but real rent-seeking, material interests in improving China's economic performance through engagement. What happened to them, and is that part of the dismantlement of their status in China, part of what we're seeing now?
It's a great question. And I guess I would argue that there was a pro-engagement coalition in China too, across a whole range of ministries, provinces, and various domestic actors, because they could rent seek. There was the beauty of engagement in both societies was its elasticity. It was a place for everybody, a stakeholderness, you might say, on the American side. That in any American foreign policy needs buy-in from the public and from the Congress. So engagement allowed for cross-spectrum buy-in, but on the Chinese side, similarly. So I would argue, again, the security authorities in China hijacked the policy under Xi Jinping and cracked down on all those key actors, universities, intellectuals, companies, and NGOs. All of our partners became on the receiving end of the Chinese security state's repression.
I forget the name of the scholar at University of Toronto who wrote the terrific book on the history of NGOs in China. And I was in Toronto to give a lecture and had lunch with her, and she said none of the NGOs she wrote about in her case studies exist anymore, tragically. Last question for me, and then we'll open it up. I'm not a China scholar. I study, the barbarians, Japan and Korea and Australia. As I watched this evolution, some of the key moments were shaped by allies. So the 2014-15 debate in the US about what China was doing in the South China Sea was really a debate about who do we believe, Japan and the Philippines or Beijing and so on and so forth. And the Japanese influence in particular in those days was pulling the US towards competition. Now it seems it's more in the direction of pulling the US back from too much competition. Because of Five Eyes, Australia has not well known, but very deep opportunities to engage the US debate. What's your sense of the role of close allies, Australia, Japan, the UK, in this evolution, in this debate, and going forward?
Well, great question. And I hope that this lecture at the U.S. Studies Center gives the audience some insights into the United States. This book is really about America. It's not about U.S.-China relations per se. It's about how Americans think about China. But your question is different and very important because the engagement policy had elasticity, and the American allies in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific, we call it now, had their own variations and had buy-in to it. But for various reasons, they too began to encounter problems. In this country, it was inside Australia's borders. Well, no, there were Australian businessmen who were arrested back in 2012, I think, you know, a couple of them. And then Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton began, you know, flagship corporations began to run into some trouble. So the Australian corporate sector began to hit troubles. The academic sector began to encounter troubles. The NGOs began to encounter troubles, and so on. But so I would say that European allies have had the same reaction to China's turn post-2017 and are essentially in sync with the American comprehensive competition approach. In fact, you know, Europe's a big place, 28 member states, hard to generalize about, but von der Leyen in particular, but all the major players. So I think Europe is still where the United States is vis-a-vis China on tech issues, export controls, inbound FDI from Chinese companies into their societies, restrictions on intellectual and academic exchanges. They're on the same page. NGOs, Europeans don't like it either. Asian allies, I defer to you, Mike. You really do, because I don't follow it as closely. My impression is that Asian allies have not been as directly impacted across a range of actors. The security factor has become paramount for all of them, for the Philippines, for Japan, just at least those two, not South Korea, not Australia, not Thailand yet. So it's a different dynamic in this part of the world. What do you think?
Well, you've been in Australia, you've spoken with officials of DFAT and ONI, and probably have a good sense. The Japanese have been competing with China for over 2,000 years. They want and need the US to be competing on technology, on defense, on diplomacy. But I would say are a little bit nervous right now about whether the US knows exactly where this is heading. Korea is complicated. Korean views of China are even worse than American views. That poll you showed, if it were Korea, the Korean public is even more negative about China. But Korea is a polarized society. The left is suspicious of the US, the right loves the US and is suspicious of China. So there's variation, probably more variation in Asia than you have in Europe. But some countries, as you said, the Philippines, Japan, I think in some ways Australia and India are discovering a new China. You probably saw that in February, a Chinese Surface Action Group, a naval task force, circumnavigated Australia for the first time. So it's a very dynamic, very dynamic situation. So why don't we open it up? I think probably Professor Shambaugh knows some of you, but for everyone else, if you could identify yourself, that'd be great. We have a microphone. And if not, I have a million questions.
Don't be shy.
Gosh, usually our audience is not so, please. Yeah, we do need a microphone up front here, Janine.
Thank you very much, David. I enjoyed your work as usual. I would just pick up on a few things. One is the notion of expectations. Another is what I would put it, that for a considerable period of time, both sides saw a common interest in having the engagement move forward. I mean, there were always sort of outliners, if you want to put it this way, in certain circumstances, like before he got into office, Reagan was totally Taiwan. I don't know if he ever really diverged from that, but he made his concessions. So you had remarkable situations where sides would bend over deeply to each other. I can cite two quite different cases. One concerns the final stages of normalization when Deng was called in for an extra meeting because the nervous Nellies in Washington, if I can put it that way, wanted an extra confirmation from him that China would accept arms sales to Taiwan, which he had indicated before to Woodcock that he would.
Mhm.
And when this was coming up again, he blew his fuse. He says, "What the fuck are you people talking about? You know what we want to do and we know what you want to do. So why the hell are you coming back to me with this? So what should we do now?" And basically it was to put it under the rug. And, and poor old Hua Guofeng would make the statement that we accept this, but this was the logical outcome of the whole process. And the whole process, I don't think either side fully understood how it was working because they were both seeing it as so difficult.
Mhm.
And there may be more difficulties in certain segments in the US, but certainly not in China at that time. They just didn't understand and they didn't push when the US made movements in about, excuse me for the precise timing, but
Mhm.
July, August, saying, basically, you can have it. But then they wouldn't push the negotiations forward. They just waited for the US to come more and more clear. So
Mhm.
that was not particularly great
Mhm.
diplomatic performance by Deng, who gets so much credit for everything. Then look, well, how many years later? 1989, Tiananmen. Okay, a pretty difficult time. And Bush sends people over immediately to pat Deng on the head and say, "Look, don't worry, we've got your back. You do what you have to do to get through this. We're still on the engagement page." I think the major thing through this
Mhm.
is, well, as I say, that both sides wanted this. So it was no great, certainly in the, excuse me, the Carter administration, there was no great, how shall we say, initiative to do what they wanted. But with
So Professor, if I can I'm worried about time a little bit.
yeah, okay, I'm blabbing too much. David knows that I can do that. I'll just say another issue is the question of power and how this shifts. Of course, when Deng said, "You fuckers know what
Mhm.
we're doing," he knew he was hiding his forces was not some great strategic thing, but just a smart guy
Well,
seeing reality.
So
Okay.
there was an urgency to getting the relationship right,
There was an urgency.
and it was about power, and it was about the Soviet threat to both countries, and it was about China's need to modernize. When I did interviews of Brzezinski and Harold Brown and others for one of my books, and I asked them what word described your thinking about China in 1978, 79, and the word that most of them said was weak. They needed a strong China. So there was that sort of compelling thing. So was it sustainable realistically when all of these other issues were being sort of, Deng wanted them brushed under the rug to focus on the big problem?
Well, that was in some ways Oxenberg's genius or common sense, that he foresaw the day when the Soviet factor would no longer be the glue that held the US-China relationship together. Whereas the big didn't really see beyond the Soviet factor. And Mike said, we have to have a foundation here so that if the Soviet factor dissipates or disappears altogether, that this relationship has a foundation on which to stand. So that's where the 7 tactics come in. So I don't want to give Mike too much credit, but I think he had some prescience there.
Other questions? Yes, please, in the front here.
Hi, I'm Max from the ANU School of Politics and International Relations. And David, I was going to ask, what are the schools of thought on this inside China, on engagement?
Was there what inside?
What are the schools?
Schools of thought.
Good topic for your next book. The 5 schools of thought on America right now in China, or the 3 schools, or the.
Well, not to be flippant, but I refer you to the appendix. I do categorize these writers, but there's not as much variance there as you find on the American side. As I say, they all feel and argue in print that the Americans are aggressive and trying to subvert, contain, they've got this sort of stock phraseology. There's not a lot of variance in what they write. Now, what they individually may feel and express verbally to you is different than what they write because of the censorship system and the self-censorship system. So there's much greater kind of conformity than variance nowadays in the last 10 years. When I wrote my previous book on China's America Watchers, there was some variance. I had my schools then, but they're all on the same song sheet, singing from the same song sheet, and it's Xi Jinping's song sheet, and it's the Americans' problem. We are reacting to an aggressive, imperialistic, subversive United States. Now, that's what the Zhongyang tells them, and then they just kind of repeat it. There are 1 or 2 individuals I found that are off the song sheet. They didn't get the memo, or they're brave souls. One guy from the China Foreign Affairs University named Li, who spent a year in Washington as a Fulbright scholar at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he interviewed broadly around Washington. He had his ear to the ground in the late Obama administration. He ran into the subterranean debate that we were all having in those years. And he picked up on it, and he wrote some really interesting articles that had a really granular feel for different perspectives amongst, a lot of people we know. And but he was a rare case. There were maybe 1 or 2 others. Jisa even, not a great deal of.
There's one Jisha Beda. The scholarship at China on the U.S. Doesn't use public opinion polling. You rarely see it. It tends to be what you'd study at the Marxist-Leninist Center where you were, which is big pronouncements, big agreements, leader-level summits, looking for a dialectic. Do you think that this is something of a failure of sort of research methodology in China, or is it more about basically the chill over dissent from Xi Jinping thought?
It's a good question. I'm sure they'd look at all the Pew polling and stuff, and they're better. I'll put it this way: they are better, the America Watchers, at explaining things that happen in America post facto, after they happen. What they're not good about is anticipating. They don't have their ear to the ground. They don't have a kind of cultural or political cultural feel for the debates. So the MAGA movement completely surprised them in 2017. But then, if you read through, as I have in the appendix, the subsequent 2 years, they drilled down to try and explain to themselves where the MAGA movement came from. And there's pretty interesting, detailed analyses that are empirically correct. So
it could be familiar to Chinese, the Cultural Revolution.
Exactly. So they're a vacuum cleaner approach. They devour American news, but they don't really spend much time talking to Americans, or they talk to a very thin slice of Americans, the ones in the re-engagement school, their friends. And those Americans just reinforce their proclivities, I would argue. They don't invite the Mearsheimer. Well, Mearsheimer has been on a lecture tour of China once or twice, but they don't invite a lot of individuals. And they have alienated a lot of China watchers, myself included. I got banned from China for 9 years because of one article.
Is that the Wall Street Journal piece?
Yes.
Yeah.
One article. talk
And you
about-
didn't choose the title, as I recall. They
didn't.
didn't like the title, but
They
the
didn't
Wall
like
Street
the
Journal
title.
editorial page
But,
chose it.
what kind of ridiculous reaction, overreaction is that? But, I can name you a number of other leading American China specialists that they have just alienated. So, they're not good to their friends.
Yeah.
And they will only listen to, and I'm not going to name names here, people that reinforce their own propaganda.
Yes, sir. Can you wait for a microphone? I'm not sure they will in the back. You do have a loud voice. I'll credit you that. Thanks.
You mentioned that if one strategy was to wait him out, what sort of time frame would you put on that, and what would follow it?
One strategy was to
If we wait out Xi
wait
Jinping.
out.
If you wait,
That's an actuarial question.
it's an actuarial, yes. If you wait him out, what's the time scale and what would follow?
Yeah. Well, there is an, excuse me, an actuarial question, or, he could lose power by other means, shall we say. As long as well, there are changes. This is not, even in the last 6 months, I notice some change, some loosening, you might say, in Xi's grip over or monopolization of levers of power. He's beginning to delegate a little more to certain other individuals, namely Sai Chi, Li Qiang, and Ding Xuexiang. So anyway, but as long as he's in power, what we've seen for the last 13 years, broadly speaking, is going to be the story. He has to leave power for the story to change. And then there are many people in the party and in the society who would, as I would hypothesize, snap back. Open up again, be more tolerant of civil society, be more tolerant of foreign presence, do a whole variety of things that had been the case prior to Xi Jinping. That's a hypothesis based on the Fang Shou cycle.
And so people will remove the Xi Jinping thought apps from their mobile phones. And is there a darker scenario where the post-Xi leadership, I guess that depends on contingency in part, on the economy or international affairs?
Well, there could be a military coup that removed him from power, and a military coup could be even more draconian than his rule has been, I suppose one has to say. I'm not predicting a coup, but I never rule out coups in such systems. There is so much discontent with Xi Jinping inside of China and inside of the party. It's palpable. You don't have to probe very far when you're having conversations with Chinese inside of China. Outside of China, you don't have to probe at all. It just comes tumbling out. They're just so glad to be outside their country, and they can tell you what they actually think. But inside of China, when I was last there about a year ago, I had a number of conversations, and there's just widespread discontent, which is different than opposition, discontent. But how that will manifest itself, hard to predict.
James Curran in the back.
James Curran, History Department here at Sydney Uni. Thanks very much for your presentation. Particularly interested in your schools of thought. I've just finished a paper myself on the schools of thought in Australia's China debate in recent years. But I wanted to go back to your presentation. You talked a lot about American expectations. You used the phrase that Americans wanted to change China, and you talked about the liberalisation policy, but which was not about democratisation. Now, what is at the root, in your view, what is the root assumption driving those expectations? Is it American nationalism? And secondly, since China has changed under Xi Jinping, at times when I read the US-China debate, I feel there's a new school of thought as well, in addition to the ones that you outline, and that is a narrative of disappointment and almost betrayal.
Right.
That is that with all the effort that was put into liberalisation, in fact, China didn't turn out the way we wanted them to. And that takes me right back to Dean Acheson's letter of transfer to Truman on the China White Paper. Remember where he said, the Chinese people have forsworn their true heritage. They were just the puppets of Moscow then. Now, they haven't turned out the way that America wanted them to turn out. So I wonder how important American nationalism and its very powerful ideological beliefs is a part of this story as well.
Well, a great set of observations, and I would just first completely agree with you about the disappointment factor. There's enormous disappointment amongst those who were involved with, supportive of the engagement policy, myself included. A lot of us are just really sad is the only word for the direction that China has taken in the last 13 years, which is a highly, this gets to your basic question, China has gone in a profoundly illiberal direction in the last 13 years. Yes, it's a communist one-party state all the time anyhow, but so I wouldn't use the word American nationalism. I'd use the word American exceptionalism and American liberalism. The bottom line of my book's argument is Americans have tried to change China and turn it and modernize it. And modernization theory, which some of you are old enough to remember, was the underlying logic of the engagement strategy initially. But the liberal Americans are missionaries. They're political missionaries. We want to, we believe in our system and we want others to emulate it. And in some cases, even forcibly impose it on others. But I'm not saying that's all correct. I'm just observing that that is a consistent pattern of American, and many are obviously very, uncomfortable with that. But what was I going to say? Last point, lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, but there is a scholar at the University of California, Davis, named David McCourt. He produced a wonderful book a year ago about more or less the same subject, but he drills into the engagement, disengagement debates inside the Beltway. He spent 2 years in Washington interviewing systematically Americans, and this book is entitled something similar title to mine, Broken Engagement or Disengagement or something. I would recommend that book to you, but he's at work now on a book comparing Australian, British, and American debates about China policy. So he's been spending, I don't know if you've come across David McCourt, he's spent a lot of time here. He's British, but
okay.
yeah.
I think I'm going to give your former student a chance to, Jamie, to
Okay.
professor here at UCID to get his revenge.
I'll be gentle. Yeah, I felt like I was back. Jamie Riley, I teach Chinese politics here. I felt like I was back in graduate school again. I'm still sitting in the back of the classroom, but listening to your lectures. Thank you so much, David, for the presentation. I look forward to assigning the book in my class. My question is about a part of the engagement coalition in the U.S. was, of course, the business community. And a key driver of that was one of the oldest motivations, money. So the Americans made a whole lot of money off selling things to China and advanced manufacturing, in particular on the West Coast. Think of Boeing and the IT sector did very well for a long time as part of engagement. It was a key driver supporting that, as well as capital out in New York's backing that. And as China's become more technologically sophisticated, they've climbed the ladder, so much so that they're producing a lot of those products themselves under their own brands, whether it's cars and almost up to computers, phones, and now airplanes. And this has clearly caused a lot of competition with both Western Europe and with the United States, particularly the West Coast manufacturing sectors. What role has that played, you think, in shifting some of the attitudes in the U.S. on China policy? Thanks.
Great question, Jamie. And the business community has been, many would argue, the ballast of the engagement coalition all along. And but there's a whole section in chapter 6 on the business community. They too began to encounter multiple impediments, elevated impediments, shall we say. They've had to work around and deal with various impediments to their joint ventures and their work in China for many years. But after the global financial crisis, they too, across a number of sectors, and this is reflected in the polling of the American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing and Shanghai, more than the U.S.-China Business Council polls. But so they too are part of the story. Yet they're not all in. If you look at the chamber's polls, about 50%, I think, this year argue that they do not plan to leave China, But that means that the other 50% are already have one foot out the door and have been for some time. This is called the China Plus strategy in CEO suites. One foot in because there's so many sunk costs, billions of dollars, and the market, this tantalizing market that goes back to 1784 when the American clipper ship Empress of China first landed in Guangzhou. So, you know, as Americans, oh, got to sell oil for the lamps of China, John Rockefeller, so on. So yes, and profit. The Chamber's polls show that the majority of American companies are profitable, but they are encountering all kinds of impediments. So that's part of the broader coalition. They're still there, but not in the depth and the breadth that they were.
The structure of the American economic relation with China is so different from Australia's. And so you have very different debates in the Business Council of Australia than you have in the US Chamber now in Washington, which is pretty divided on China with a lot of negative views. So the economic factor is quite important. One last question over here. We'll wait for the mic if it's okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent session. My name's Craig Dower. I'm a business person who has spent a lot of time in China up until perhaps 10 years ago, a lot less in the last decade. And picking up the thread of the first question, this sort of period of disengagement, for want of a better phrase, a lot has changed in the business context in China. My career has been in IT and intellectual property, and the Chinese get beaten up quite regularly for IP theft. But the truth is that the terms of engagement in China were often very clear about technology transfer. And it seems that companies from all around the world were quite happy to do that in order to get a foothold in the market. But only up until a point where that competition became a threat. So that's the first part. The second part is we look what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years and the Xi Jinping made in China 2025. You go across pretty much every industry sector and you do the research on who are the dominant companies in the world today. In many cases, they're Chinese. The pure scale and volume and sophistication of technology and manufacturing processes and so on. So assuming that we do re-engage more broadly at some point in time, we're going to be engaging in a very different context where the world has changed massively in a technological and industry sense in that 10 to 15 year window. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, thank you, sir. And I think you and Jamie, make a really important point about real competitiveness in various industries. The Chinese are now world leading in several industries. Electric vehicles certainly come to mind, but others. So the impediments, it's not just a question of impediments to doing business in China and with China. There's serious competition for foreign companies. It gets to the innovation debate that is taking place in the United States now, especially as President Trump's administration is cracking down on universities and on the federal agencies that give massive amounts of funding for research and development and innovation, and really be very isolationist policies. So there's one major school of thought in the United States is that this is just the worst possible thing the United States can do. It's just shooting ourselves in the foot, undermining our greatest asset, which is our innovative capacity, and that we're just turning into a kind of an island. That's one school of thought. And of course, the Trump administration has a more island view of this, that we can't share our innovation and technology with the Chinese, whereas every scientist I've ever talked to, and many people in the tech sector say, oh, innovation is a, is a globalized phenomenon. You can't disentangle it on sovereign bases. In fact, innovation is so this is an ongoing debate that's just beginning in the US, I would say.
So the US-China relationship is incredibly consequential for the entire world, not just US and China. Living here, David, I can't tell you how many articles and headlines there are about the future of the U.S.-China relationship. When John Howard was prime minister, he was asked in a press conference when he was visiting my boss, President Bush, about how can you have the U.S. as your closest security partner and China as your closest trading partner? What he should have said is, look at foreign direct investment, which is overwhelming with the U.S. But what he said was, with a twinkle in his eye, this is 2005, he said, we look forward to our close friendship with the United States and getting rich from our relationship with China or something like that. But that balancing act is becoming incredibly difficult for many countries. So the book is terrific, you can tell, and it really unpacks the U.S.-China relationship in a very systematic way. You can hear that, which really helps you understand the variables that will shape where we go. It's not all depressing. I find in my own dialogues with Chinese counterparts, when they visit Sydney or when I'm never in China, usually in Korea, or there's more sadness than anger. I find it's not, there's it's a minority in both countries that wants to completely give up.
Right.
I would say.
Yep.
Yeah.
Myself
But you need to
included.
understand how we got here if you're going to start.
Yep.
It's someday patching it together, and in the meantime, competing without catastrophe.
That's right.
Thank you all very much for coming. And I don't know if you have little time to talk to folks. Thank you also to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, for bringing Professor Shambaugh to Australia. And we'll conclude with that, but wonderful lecture. Thank you very much, David.
All right.
Thanks.